Have you ever wondered why certain stories in the Bible are locked away? Why some narratives, etched into the Holy Scriptures, are almost never spoken from the pulpit? Why some names are only whispered, as if they carry a secret too dangerous, too volatile to be revealed? Among those names, one echoes with a particular, unsettling power: Tamar. The story that no sermon ever wants to tell is precisely one of those narratives. She is a woman whose name is recorded in the sacred text, but whose life story is deliberately avoided, conveniently forgotten, and buried deep in the comfortable silence of our traditions. But today, that silence breaks. Today, you are going to learn the complete, unvarnished truth. You will discover who Tamar really was in the pages of the Bible, why her story is so profoundly disturbing to our modern sensibilities, and most importantly, get ready for this, what her truly extraordinary role was in the single greatest plan in all of human history. Be warned, this is not a story for the faint of heart. This is not a gentle parable. It is a raw account of courage when all hope seems lost. It is about demanding justice when the entire world, and the very men who were supposed to protect you, condemn you. And it is, fundamentally, about how God often uses the very things and the very people that the world casts aside. You must stay until the end, because the final revelation about Tamar will leave you speechless. What you thought you knew about this woman, or what you assumed you knew, was completely and utterly wrong. How many times have you heard a sermon about Tamar? The answer is likely never. And that is not an accident. Her story is right there, recorded for all to see in the sacred pages of Genesis. But it is treated as if it is a well-kept, shameful secret. Think about it. There are stories in the Bible that preachers love to tell, the greatest hits of faith: David and Goliath, a story of underdog victory; Moses at the Red Sea, a story of divine deliverance; Daniel in the lion's den, a story of unwavering faith. These are the narratives that inspire and comfort us. But Tamar, she remains silent, locked away. She is one of the Bible's least preached stories, buried beneath thick layers of theological discomfort and profound misunderstanding. Why? Why the silence? It is because Tamar's story shatters our comfort zone. It refuses to fit into our tidy boxes of morality. It forces us to look directly at harrowing truths about systemic injustice, about raw feminine courage, and about how God works through events that the world and even the church would label as scandalous. It is a revealing foundational story that shakes up our limited view of redemption. But today, we will break that silence. We are going to dig up what was buried. Let us discover together why Tamar deserved not just to be remembered, but to be celebrated and honored. Why her story should not be whispered in shame, but shouted from the rooftops as a stunning example of faith, resilience, and sheer determination. Prepare your heart. You are about to meet one of the bravest, most misunderstood women to ever walk the earth. A woman who, with one act of desperate courage, changed the entire course of history. Imagine a young woman walking through the arid, sun-baked lands of Canaan over 3,800 years ago. The scorching sun beats down, but it is not the physical heat that oppresses her. It is the crushing weight of hopelessness she carries on her shoulders. Tamar in the Bible was not just another name lost in a complex and ancient genealogy. She was a real woman, with real hopes and dreams, living in a deeply patriarchal time when a woman's entire destiny, her value, her safety, her very future depended entirely on the men in her family. First her father, then her husband. Her name, Tamar, means palm tree, a tree that is known to withstand the fiercest desert winds, a tree that can find water even in the driest, most desolate of lands. What a prophetic irony, because Tamar would need every ounce of that resilience to face what was to come. Her story begins with a marriage that seemed promising. She married the firstborn son of Judah. Yes, that Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, a leader of one of the great tribes of Israel. It should have been a good marriage, securing her a prosperous life. But the arrangement was cut short. Died young. The scripture is blunt and offers no further detail, stating only that he was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Genesis 38:7. And there, Tamar's nightmare began. She was left a young, childless widow. In our world, this is a tragedy. In her culture, it was a catastrophe. In a society where a woman's worth was tied directly to her ability to bear sons, a childless widow was considered cursed, useless, and without a future. She had no protection, no inheritance, and no social standing. But there was one path, one ray of hope provided by the law itself, the custom of levirate marriage. According to this sacred biblical tradition, if a man died childless, his brother was obligated to marry the widow. This was not about romance. It was a vital social and spiritual duty. The first son born would be considered the heir of the deceased brother, ensuring that his name and his lineage would not be erased from history. For a woman like Tamar, this law represented her only chance at dignity, her only purpose, and her only future. So, Judah gave Tamar his second son, Onan. But Onan, knowing the child would not be his heir, wickedly refused to fulfill his duty, and for this he too was put to death by the Lord. Now Judah, a respected patriarch and a man of immense influence, was terrified. He had one son left, Shelah. He looked at Tamar and promised her that she would marry Shelah, his third son, when he reached the appropriate age. This law of levirate marriage was sacred. It was not just a cultural preference, but a commandment that ensured the family line. Tamar believed Judah's promise. She did exactly as she was told. She returned to her father's house, as was the custom, to wait. And she waited. Days became agonizing months. Months bled into desolate years. Shelah grew up. He became a man, and nothing happened. Judah simply forgot his promise. Or far worse, he consciously chose to ignore it, to abandon her. The biblical explanation for this betrayal is clear and painful. Judah was afraid. 2 of his sons had already died, and in his grief, he began to see Tamar as the threat, as if she were a curse, a bringer of bad luck. It was far easier for him to break his sacred vow, to condemn her to a life of desolation, than to risk losing his third and final son. But Judah, in his fear and his power, failed to understand one fundamental thing. You cannot break a promise made before God without severe consequences. And Tamar, the woman left with nothing, was about to teach us all that when human justice fails and the men who are supposed to protect you become your oppressors, God still has a plan. Years passed. Judah's sacred promise turned to dust, and along with it, all of Tamar's dreams. She was no longer just a widow in waiting. She had become one of the wronged women of the Bible. A forgotten figure, relegated to a life of permanent oblivion in a society that had absolutely no place for women without male protection or a son. Can you imagine the silent pain of her existence? With every wedding feast she heard celebrated in the distance, with every newborn child she saw, Tamar was brutally reminded of what she had been denied, what Judah had stolen from her. This was not just about an abstract desire for children. It was about her right to dignity. It was about her purpose. It was about her very right to exist fully in a society that had functionally rejected her. The injustice was blatant, and it was public. Judah, the powerful patriarch, had broken not only a personal promise to his daughter-in-law, but a divine law. He had condemned Tamar to a life of emptiness, desolation, and shame. And perhaps the worst part of all, everyone knew. The community saw Shelah grow to manhood. They saw Tamar languishing in her father's house, and no one did anything. Society simply accepted that some promises can be broken, especially when it suits the powerful. But God does not tolerate injustice. And Tamar was about to discover that when human systems fail, when the powerful betray their trust, the Lord has surprising, even shocking ways to restore what was stolen. She just needed the courage to take a single step. A step so bold, so radical, that it still leaves us speechless thousands of years later. What would you do if every door was slammed in your face? If every promise made to you was broken? If the entire world conspired against your right to exist with dignity, most would surrender to despair. But Tamar decided to act. And her action was so unexpected, so outside the bounds of acceptable behavior, that it became one of the most shocking and controversial stories in the entire Bible. The moment came when she received news. She learned that Judah, her father-in-law, was going up to the town of Timnah to shear his sheep, a time of business, but also of festivity. A plan formed in her mind, a plan that required an iron will and extraordinary courage. She made her move. She took off her widow's clothes, the drab garments that were the very symbols of her forgotten condition and her social death. And then, she covered herself with a veil, transforming her identity, and disguised herself. She did not seek him out in his camp. She positioned herself strategically. She sat at the entrance to Enaim, a town that was on the road Judah would have to travel. And there, she waited. A righteous woman, wronged by the system, had transformed herself into a mysterious, veiled figure. She was a woman no longer waiting for justice to be given to her. She was a woman, determined to seize what had been unjustly denied. It was an impossibly risky plan. It was beyond dangerous. If she were discovered, if her true identity were revealed at the wrong moment, she would not be praised for her ingenuity. She would be sentenced to a brutal public death by stoning or fire for perceived promiscuity. But Tamar had reached a point of no return. A life without dignity, without purpose, without a future, was no life at all. She would rather risk everything on this one desperate gambit than passively accept the crushing injustice that had become her reality. Judah, traveling on his way to Timnah, saw the veiled woman sitting by the entrance to Enaim. He did not recognize her. How could he? In his eyes, Tamar was a problem he had already solved. A widow tucked away in her father's house, forgotten and powerless. He saw only what her disguise intended him to see. A cult prostitute, a common and sordid part of the pagan landscape in those days. And here, the central, bitter irony of the story clicks into place. The very same man who had piously denied Tamar her legal righteous due as a wife now, driven by his own base desires, sought her out as a stranger for a moment of pleasure. The hypocrisy was perfect, but it was also prophetic. The encounter took place. Judah, completely unaware of who he was dealing with, made his proposition. He promised to send a young goat from his flock as payment. But Tamar was smarter. She had not come this far, risked this much, to walk away with a mere promise of payment from a man whose promises meant nothing. She needed something more. She needed irrefutable proof. So she asked for a pledge. "What pledge shall I give you?" he asked. Tamar's answer was precise and brilliant. She asked for his signet ring, his cord, and his staff. These were not random objects. In that culture, these items were the equivalent of a modern man's signature, his credit card, and his passport, all rolled into one. They were intensely personal, unique objects that would identify him, the powerful patriarch Judah, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Blinded by his own impulses, Judah handed them over. The trap was set. 3 agonizing months passed. Then, news reached Judah's household. A breathless messenger delivered the report. "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot, and moreover, she is pregnant by harlotry." Judah's reaction was immediate, absolute, and merciless. There was no investigation, no compassion, no self-reflection. Filled with a righteous fury that was, in fact, the deepest hypocrisy, he pronounced the horrific sentence. "Bring her out," he commanded, "and let her be burned." Genesis 38:24. The same man who had broken God's sacred law now became a harsh and zealous judge, ready to condemn to a fiery death the very woman he had personally wronged and abandoned. The patriarch's honor, it seemed, had to be protected at all costs. And so came the most dramatic, heart-stopping moment in the entire narrative. Tamar was dragged from her home, taken to be publicly executed. The crowds gathered, the judgment was set. But as she was being led out, she sent the objects to her father-in-law. She did not accuse him publicly, not at first. She sent a simple, devastating, and private message that would force a public reckoning. By the man to whom these belong, her message read, "I am pregnant." Genesis 38:25. Imagine the scene. Judah, standing in judgment, receives the bundle. He unrolls the cloth, and his blood runs cold. There, for all to see, are his signet, his cord, and his staff. There was no escape. There was no denial. The confrontation was devastating and absolute. In a blinding flash of shame, he understood everything. He understood her desperation, his own profound failure, and the divine justice that had just cornered him. The shame he intended for Tamar became, in fact, only Judah's shame. And then, from his mouth, came the words that would echo down the centuries. In front of everyone, the patriarch, the leader, the powerful man, was forced to admit the truth. She is more righteous than I. Genesis 38:26. It was a total vindication. The woman he had abandoned, the woman he had just sentenced to death, was more righteous, more in line with God's law than he was. Tamar had won. But her victory was far greater than she could have possibly imagined. She was about to discover that her act of desperate courage was not just about her own survival. It was part of a divine plan far greater than anyone in that crowd could have possibly understood. She is more righteous than I. Those words from Judah were not just a simple admission of guilt. They were a stunning prophetic declaration of God's justice, a justice that had worked through impossible and scandalous circumstances. Tamar had been completely vindicated. What had seemed certain to be her ruin, her execution by fire, had in an instant transformed into her redemption. What the entire world would look at and see as a scandal, God had just revealed as an act of profound justice. Tamar had not sought petty personal revenge. She had sought the fulfillment of a divine promise, the right to a family and a future that men, in their fear and hypocrisy, had chosen to ignore. And God's justice was manifested in an extraordinary way. Tamar was not only vindicated, but she was also honored. She gave birth to twins, Perez and Zerah. These two sons represented not only her personal victory and the end of her desolation, but also the continuation and fulfillment of the divine purpose that had been nearly destroyed by human negligence. So why? Why is Tamar still one of the forgotten women of the Bible? Why is her story so rarely the subject of sermons? It is perhaps because she challenges us, even today, to rethink our comfortable concepts of morality, of justice, and of exactly how God works in the world. Tamar does not fit into our neat and tidy religious categories. She was not a perfect heroine like Esther. She was not a respected prophetess like Deborah. She was not an exemplary patient mother like Sarah. She was something much more complicated and, paradoxically, much more powerful. She was a woman who refused to be erased. She refused to passively accept injustice. Her courage was far beyond what anyone expected, and her method was, by any traditional standard, highly questionable. But her heart was fiercely aligned with divine justice. She understood something that many religious leaders of her day and ours fail to grasp, that sometimes, when all systems fail, faith requires you to act. The Bible's underpreached stories are often the very ones we need to hear the most. They show us that God does not just work through the perfect, the pristine, and the traditionally acceptable. He works through real, messy people with real, messy problems who are facing real and painful injustices. Tamar teaches us that being forgotten by men does not ever mean being forgotten by God. That being rejected by society does not mean being rejected by the Creator. That sometimes the very people the world considers problematic or scandalous are precisely the ones God chooses to fulfill His most important and eternal purposes. And speaking of important purposes, are you ready for the most impressive, the most staggering revelation about Tamar? Here is the truth that will leave you speechless, the truth that preachers may have hidden from you. That woman who was nearly stoned and burned, that woman who was called a harlot, that woman who was forgotten by the powerful, that very same woman, Tamar, became a part of the direct lineage of Jesus Christ. Yes, you heard that correctly. Tamar and the lineage of Jesus are eternally connected. Her son, Perez, the son born from that desperate, scandalous act of justice, became a direct ancestor of the Messiah. The sacred biblical genealogy, recorded in the very first chapter of the New Testament, in Matthew 1:3, states it plainly for all to see. Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. What seemed like the most controversial and shameful story in Judah's family line turned out to be a critical, indispensable part of the greatest plan in human history. The woman who was nearly executed for bringing dishonor became one of the few women named and honored in Jesus' genealogy. From apparent shame to eternal glory, God chose to include Tamar in the Savior's lineage. He did not hide her story. He did not omit her because of the controversial circumstances. On the contrary, he highlighted her, he celebrated her, and he made her an essential part of the narrative of our redemption. This reveals something profound about the very character of God. He is not ashamed to use complicated people. He does not need our story to be perfect to include us in his grand plan. In fact, he specializes in transforming what the world calls scandal into his glory. Tamar's story proves that there is no life too lost for God to redeem. There is no situation so complicated that he cannot transform it. What men reject, God often chooses for his most sacred purposes. What can we learn from Tamar today? First, never accept injustice passively. Tamar teaches us that we must have the courage to confront what is wrong, even when it puts us at risk. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting correctly despite the fear. Second, God sees you when you are neglected. When your needs are ignored, when your rights are trampled, God sees it all. And he has surprising ways to restore what was unjustly taken. Third, your complicated history does not disqualify you from God's purposes. Tamar's story was messy, but that did not stop her. God uses imperfect people for his perfect plans. Tamar's story is relevant because we still live in a world rife with injustice. Promises are still broken. The powerful still forget the vulnerable. In these moments, Tamar reminds us, do not give up. Have courage. Trust that God is writing a story much bigger than we can see. If you feel forgotten or wronged today, remember Tamar. She shows us that having the courage to do what is right is always worth it. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear that God does not forget the forgotten. Leave a comment. What part of Tamar's story impacted you the most? And remember, your story is still being written. If God could use a rejected woman to become part of the Savior's lineage, imagine what he can do with your life.